Every girl dreams of a perfect wedding, but what happens when the groom never shows up? That was Evelyn's nightmare, abandoned at the altar, humiliated before everyone she loved. In her darkest moment, she turned to the only man who noticed her, the security guard. But here's the twist, he wasn't just a guard, he was a hidden billionaire. What followed was a storm of forbidden love, betrayal, and a brutal war between money, power, and the heart. This isn't just a love story. It's the dangerous price of crossing the line between the poor and the untouchable rich. Let's get into it. The air inside Hall 1 of the Hugo Event Center was heavy, almost suffocating, as the orchestra played a hollow melody no one was truly listening to. Guests sat in glittering rows, their eyes fixed on the aisle. At the center of it all walked Evelyn, dressed in white, her gown trailing behind her like spilled light. But there was no groom waiting at the end. Each step echoed like a cruel reminder. With every pace forward, whispers began to spread across the hall, soft at first, then rising like a wave. Where was Aidan Lim? Why wasn't the groom here? Evelyn's face tried to hold calm, but inside she was breaking. What was supposed to be the most beautiful day of her life was turning into a public spectacle. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. The stares of old friends, of business partners, of strangers who came only for the glamour. Every pair of eyes seemed to pierce through her. She felt naked, abandoned, betrayed. Then, as though the pain wasn't already enough, Clara Lim, Aidan's mother, regal and sharp in her designer dress, rose from her seat and walked up the aisle with chilling confidence. Her voice cut through the hall, louder than the music, steadier than Evelyn's trembling heart. She declared before the hundreds of guests that her son would never marry Evelyn. Aidan, she announced, was set to become the next CEO of Verban Tech, a multi-billion-dollar empire. His future was too important to be tied down to Evelyn. The crowd gasped. Some even clapped, as if it were a business triumph rather than a human tragedy. Evelyn's vision blurred with shame as tears threatened to fall. Her fingers shook as she grabbed her phone, desperately dialing Aidan again and again. Her heart pounded with a single question. Why wasn't he here? Why wasn't he picking up? But the line stayed silent. Meanwhile, just across from the chaos of Hall 1, inside Hall 2, another storm was quietly brewing. Here, a different wedding was meant to unfold, one that wasn't born from love, but from power. Mr. Moon, the calculating head of the Moon Empire, worth over $70 billion, had arranged a surprise marriage for his only son, Francis Moon. For years, Francis had refused to take a wife, ignoring his father's pleas, lectures, and threats. But Mr. Moon was not a man who took no for an answer. Francis arrived at the venue dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, sharp and expensive as always. To everyone else, he looked like the ideal groom. But Francis had no idea that behind those decorated doors waited a bride he had never chosen. As he approached the hall, his closest aide, Charles, intercepted him with urgency. In hushed tones, Charles revealed the truth. His father had set a trap. Inside was a wedding Francis would be forced into, a public spectacle that he could not walk away from without shaming the empire. Francis's jaw tightened, but he wasn't surprised. This was his father's way. Control, manipulation, power. He had lived with it his whole life. For a moment, he considered storming out, but Charles quickly devised another plan. He suggested Francis play his father's game in reverse. The idea was reckless, but brilliant. Francis would trade clothes with a security guard, disguise himself as staff and slip into Hall 1, where no one would expect him. Meanwhile, the guard, dressed in Francis's expensive suit, would walk into Hall 2 pretending to be him. It was bold, risky, but Francis's lips curled into the faintest smile. He loved it. For once, he would outsmart his father. Within minutes, the exchange was made in a restroom between the two halls. Francis shed his identity, stepping into the plain uniform of a guard. He straightened the cap low over his face, adjusting to his new role. The guard, thrilled by the sudden fortune, strutted proudly in Francis's suit, rehearsing the swagger of a billionaire's son. And just like that, their worlds switched. The real Francis slipped unnoticed into Hall 1, while his double marched confidently into Hall 2, ready to face a marriage meant for another man. What neither of them knew was that this single act of defiance would change the course of every life in both halls. Francis slipped quietly into Hall 1, the weight of the security uniform heavy on his shoulders. He had intended only to hide from his father's scheme, but the sight that met him stopped him cold. At the center of the grand hall, Clara Lim stood tall, her diamond necklace glinting under the lights. Her laughter rang sharp and cruel, echoing against the walls as she mocked the bride, Evelyn, who stood broken at the aisle, tears streaming down her cheeks. In Clara's hand was a check, crisp and deliberate, the ink of $50,000 written like an insult rather than a gift. With a voice that carried arrogance, she pressed it into Evelyn's shaking hand, telling her she wanted her gone. If money was all she wanted, Clara would buy her silence. But Evelyn's pain held more dignity than Clara's wealth. Through blurred vision and trembling lips, she answered. She spoke of how she and Aidan had met in college, how she had loved him not for his name or fortune, but for who he was. Her voice cracked as she confessed that her love had been pure, her devotion untainted by greed. The hall grew uncomfortably silent, though only for a moment. Humiliation clung to her like a second skin as she pulled out her phone once more, desperate for answers. When Aidan finally answered, hope flared for a heartbeat, only to be shattered instantly. His words came cold, final. He said he couldn't go through with the marriage, that his family would never allow him to marry a nobody. The line went dead, and so did the last piece of Evelyn's heart. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the aisle, her white gown pooling around her like fallen snow. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but then came laughter. First Clara's sharp cackle, then the uneasy chuckles of others. Many of the guests, eager to stay in favor with the powerful Lim family, joined in mocking her. Their laughter swelled until it filled the room, drowning out Evelyn's silent sobs. At the entrance, Francis felt his stomach twist. He had seen cruelty before, but this was different. Raised under the iron rule of a billionaire father, he had been trained to understand power, wealth, and discipline. But he had also been raised with principles, values his father could never crush. To humiliate a woman in such a sacred moment was something he could not stand by and watch. Something inside him snapped. Without hesitation, Francis strode down the aisle. His footsteps rang out, silencing pockets of laughter as the crowd turned to stare at the unfamiliar security guard, breaking the invisible line between staff and guests. He reached Evelyn, his presence steady where hers was fragile. Gently, he extended his hand, lifting her from the floor with quiet strength. And then, for the first time, he truly saw her. Behind the streaks of tears, beneath the weight of disgrace, Evelyn's beauty stunned him. Her dark skin glowed under the lights, her features soft yet fierce, her brokenness laced with dignity that money could never buy. Francis leaned close, his voice low, so only she could hear. He told her to trust him, to play along, that he would not let her leave this hall in shame. And then, in front of the entire room, Francis did the unthinkable. He dropped down on one knee. The hall gasped, the laughter froze in mid-air. Looking up at Evelyn, his voice rang clear, bold, unshaken. He asked her to marry him. Right there, in front of every single guest who had ridiculed her. The room erupted in shock. What had begun as her day of ruin was twisting into something no one had expected. Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her throat. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a mountain. Just minutes ago, she had been humiliated, stripped bare before the very people who had come to celebrate her. Now she was facing something she could never have imagined. A stranger, a man in a guard's uniform, on his knees before her, asking for her hand. Her heart pounded. Her thoughts spun wildly. How did it come to this? This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the reward for years of sacrifice and endurance. Instead, it was unraveling into something out of a cruel dream. She had been dumped in front of the world by the man she thought she loved, and now she stood trembling as another man, one she had never seen before, was offering her what Aidan had just stolen away. Her mind ran backward, clinging to the story of how she had even ended up here in Seoul, in this hall, in this nightmare. She had come to this city on a scholarship, driven by nothing but ambition. Her plan had been simple: study hard, stay focused, and return home with her head held high. Love was never supposed to be part of the equation. But then she met Aidan Lim, the heartthrob of the university, the golden boy everyone admired. He had noticed her brilliance, her steady hand in academics, and soon enough, he leaned on her. First for help with assignments, then for projects, then for almost everything else. She was the foreigner, the outsider, the one who had no family in Seoul. So when Aidan began to linger near, she welcomed the company. Slowly she allowed herself to believe it was love. But the red flags had always been there. The cancelled dates, the excuses, the nights she knew he was with other girls. She told herself he would change, that this was just immaturity, that their bond was stronger than his mistakes. But he never changed. After graduation, it only grew worse. At the Verban Group, he used her sharp mind, her discipline, her brilliance. She worked endlessly behind the scenes, polishing projects that carried his name. She thought it was love. He only saw utility. Even the day he introduced her to his mother, Aidan had stood silent as Clara's sharp words tore through her dignity. He hadn't shielded her. He hadn't even flinched. And yet, when he finally suggested marriage, Evelyn convinced herself it was proof of his love. Even though they weren't ready, even though deep down she knew his heart wasn't steady, she clung to the hope that marriage would change him, that after the vows, he would finally see her worth. But here she was, on the very day of that promise, left abandoned at the altar, with nothing but whispers and laughter swirling around her. And now she faced another choice. She glanced down at the kneeling man. His name, he whispered, was Francis. His eyes held none of the mockery she had seen all around her. Instead, they carried something she hadn't felt in years: resolve. It startled her. It steadied her. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was protection. It was dignity. It was a way out of the pit she had been thrown into. The hall around her buzzed in disbelief. Murmurs rose like a storm, guests questioning, gasping, speculating. Was this real? Were they secret lovers? Was this a performance? Nobody could understand why a man, much less a security guard, would risk everything to stand up for a woman he didn't even know. Evelyn's chest tightened as she looked at him again. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was desperation. But at that moment, she thought, better to be seen standing beside a stranger than left broken and alone. And then Francis leaned closer, his lips barely moving. He mouthed something to her, words too soft for the crowd to hear, but strong enough to anchor her. For the first time that day, courage flickered in her heart. The air in Hall 1 grew tense, thick with disbelief. Gasps had barely died down when Clara Lim's face hardened, her shock twisting into fury. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and pointed a finger at Evelyn. With venom in her voice, she accused Evelyn of deceit. She spat words about manipulation, about using men for gain, about betrayal against her son. To Clara, there could only be one explanation for this scene. Evelyn must have been seeing this so-called guard behind Aidan's back. It was the only narrative that made sense to her pride. But before Evelyn could defend herself, Francis rose from his knee, his presence towering and unflinching. His uniform was plain, yet in that moment he carried the weight of authority greater than any title. His eyes locked on Clara's, steady and sharp. He warned her, stern, fearless, to stay away from his almost wedded wife. His words cut through the hall like thunder. He told her that if she and her family couldn't stomach Evelyn because of her skin or her poverty, the least they could do was leave her in peace. The crowd gasped again. Evelyn's lips parted in shock. Never, not once in all her years with Aidan, had anyone defended her like this. Not when she had been belittled, insulted, dismissed. A man who seemed to have nothing had just stood before one of the wealthiest families in Seoul and shielded her with everything he had. For the first time that night, Evelyn's tears weren't born of humiliation. They were born of awe. To her, Francis may have been nothing more than a security guard, but in that moment, he was her knight in shining armor. The priest, who had been silently suffering through Clara's earlier insults, now felt a strange joy stir in his chest. He had feared this ceremony was collapsing into scandal, but now this sudden turn, this bold rescue, felt like divine providence. His heart raced as he recalled the scriptures. "Behold, I will do a new thing. I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." To him, this was no accident. This was a miracle unfolding before his very eyes. With newfound conviction, he lifted his hands and blessed the union, declaring it sacred. The crowd, bewildered and divided, could only watch as the impossible became reality. Evelyn, who had been moments away from ruin, was now wedded under the blessing of heaven itself. Outside the hall, the night air cooled Evelyn's flushed face. She turned to Francis, her words tumbling out in a rush of gratitude and apology. She thanked him over and over, her voice breaking with relief. She confessed she didn't know how she could have endured without him stepping in. And yet, even in her gratitude, she apologized for dragging him into a storm that wasn't his. Her heart ached with guilt. Surely he had just thrown away his livelihood. The Lim family was powerful, merciless. A stunt like this would mean the end of his career. He had risked everything for her. To soften the weight, she insisted on taking him to her apartment first so she could change, then promised to treat him to a good meal. She swore she'd take him to the finest restaurants in Seoul, a small attempt to thank him for his sacrifice. In her mind, there was no question. Francis was poor. How much could a security guard possibly earn? Whatever it was, it could never compete with the influence of the Lim family, who were surely plotting to crush him already. She resolved then and there that it was now her turn to protect him. She may only be at the start of her career as an accountant, but she could still shoulder the burden until they both figured out when to quietly part ways. Yes, they would divorce, eventually. But until then, she would stand by him, as he had stood by her. What Evelyn didn't know was that Francis was no ordinary man in uniform, and what she assumed to be sacrifice was only the beginning of something far greater than either of them could yet imagine. Inside Evelyn's modest apartment, while she slipped away to change out of the torn remains of her ruined wedding gown, Francis sat quietly with the marriage certificate in his hands. The paper was still warm from the priest's ink, the official stamp glistening under the light. A smirk tugged at his lips. He pulled out his phone, snapped a crisp photo of the document, and sent it straight to Charles. Moments later, he called. His voice was calm, almost playful, as he gave his instructions. "Send this to my father. Tell him he can stop wasting his energy hunting for a wife for me. I've already found one." He chuckled to himself, picturing the look of panic on Mr. Moon's face when the message reached him. His father, who controlled boardrooms with an iron fist and dictated Francis's life down to the smallest detail, would be blindsided. "I swear," Francis thought, laughing under his breath, "I'll be the death of that man." On the other end, Charles nearly dropped his phone. His voice shook as he pleaded, warning Francis that if Mr. Moon traced this madness back to him, the idea of swapping clothes, the reckless plan, his head might roll. But Francis, stubborn as stone, dismissed his protests. Stubbornness ran in his blood. It was what made him a nightmare to his father in business and in life. With a final warning, he ordered Charles not to reveal his whereabouts to anyone. By the time Evelyn emerged, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, Francis had tucked away the certificate and the mischievous grin. Together, they stepped out into the Seoul evening, blending into the crowds of the city. For the first time since the chaos began, Evelyn looked closely at him. The tears that had clouded her eyes earlier were gone, and in their place, she saw him as he truly was. His skin was flawless, his jawline sharp and confident, his hair perfectly set in effortless waves. His presence was commanding in a way that no security guard should have been. She caught herself staring and blushed when Francis's lips curled knowingly. They walked side by side until fate decided to test them once again. Ahead on the bustling street, a familiar voice pierced the night. It was Shayna, Evelyn's senior colleague from work, arm locked with her boyfriend. Shayna's eyes widened at the sight of Evelyn, then narrowed with cruel delight. She stopped dead in her tracks, her laughter sharp and theatrical. "Well, well," Shayna sneered, her voice loud enough for passers-by to hear. "So it's true. Dumped by the Lims and now clinging to a security guard. You really thought you could marry Aiden Lim? Such confidence. Don't worry. There are other scraps left in this city." Her words hit Evelyn like stones, but this time she didn't bow her head. Her chest rose as she snapped back, reminding Shayna that she too was an immigrant, no better than her. She demanded that Shayna had no right to belittle her when they had both clawed their way up from nothing. The remark stung. Shayna's face twisted in rage as she shot back, declaring herself far superior. She waved dismissively at Francis. "At least my boyfriend is a top executive at the Moon Empire, while your fake husband is nothing more than a security guard." The boyfriend, eager to bask in the lie, smirked arrogantly and patted Shayna's hand. With mock pity, he looked at Francis and Evelyn, urging Shayna not to waste her breath on lowlifes. He had no idea who he was speaking to. Francis burst into laughter, loud, genuine, mocking, the kind of laugh that rattled pride. He stared at the man with an amused glint in his eye and repeated, "A top executive at the Moon Empire, are you?" His tone dripped with irony. Then, in a voice cold and cutting, he mocked them both. He ridiculed the boyfriend for stealing an identity just to impress Shayna, a woman he deemed not worth the effort. He laughed at their clothes, pointing out how desperately they tried to pose as high society while wearing cheap imitations of designer brands. His insults were precise, merciless, and every word struck true. Shayna's face flushed crimson, her boyfriend's pride cracking under the weight of the humiliation. But Shayna snapped back with finality, insisting, "Boyce is a top executive. No insult can drag him down to your level." With that, they stormed off, her laughter hollow, his shoulders stiff. Evelyn's heart swelled. No one had ever defended her like this, not in school, not in work, not even with Aiden. Every time she had been stepped on in this city, she had stood alone. But now, beside this mysterious man, she felt shielded, valued, almost cherished. For the first time in years, she felt something stir in her chest that wasn't fear or shame. She walked closer, brushing lightly against him as they continued on. As they entered the glow of the restaurant district, Francis slipped his phone from his pocket once more. His expression didn't change, his stride steady, but his fingers moved swiftly across the screen. He sent a message to Charles with a single question. Check if a Boyce works at the Moon Empire. If yes, terminate his employment immediately. The night carried on, but the ripple of Francis's quiet power had already begun. When Evelyn promised to take Francis to the best restaurant in town, he had imagined chandeliers, velvet chairs, and gold-plated menus, the kind of luxury he had known all his life. But instead, they ended up in a modest, bustling street-side restaurant where the air smelled of spice and fried food. The plastic chairs wobbled slightly under their weight, and the tables bore the marks of years of service. For a moment, Francis froze. This was far from the five-star dining he was used to. He had grown up in palaces of marble and crystal, where chefs were flown in from Paris and Tokyo. Yet here he was, in a place where laughter was loud, plates clattered, and the waiters carried trays with grease-stained aprons. But he masked his surprise. His cover depended on it. Evelyn, however, caught the fleeting expression on his face. She mistook it for worry and quickly leaned in with a soft smile. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll cover the bill tonight. The food here is simple, but trust me, it's some of the best you'll ever taste." And she was right. As the dishes arrived, steaming bowls of stew, spiced meats, and fluffy rice, the flavors exploded with authenticity. Francis found himself nodding in agreement, though part of him was still stunned. As they ate, Evelyn lowered her gaze and spoke softly. "I'm sorry for earlier, for making you lose your job because of me. I feel terrible about it." Francis looked at her curiously as she continued, "If you're worried about where to stay, I can help. I can even accommodate you for a while, until you find your feet again." He almost dropped his fork. Her kindness stunned him. In a world where most people calculated every move, here was a woman who had just been publicly humiliated, and yet she was worried about him. Gently, he asked about the scene at the wedding hall. Her voice trembled as she explained the betrayal, the cruelty of Clara Lim, and the shame that still burned in her chest. Francis watched her closely. At first, his plan had been simple: protect her in the moment, save her dignity, then disappear. But the longer she spoke, the more he realized there was something extraordinary about Evelyn, something rare. Her openness, her warmth, her refusal to let bitterness poison her soul. She wasn't like the women he had known in the glittering halls of wealth. She was pure in a way that shook him. But then her words cut deep. "I hate wealthy people," she said suddenly, bitterness flickering in her eyes. "They act like gods, looking down on everyone else. I don't want anything to do with them anymore. I'm content with my small, ordinary life." Francis felt a sharp pang in his chest. He hadn't expected that. How could he tell her the truth now? How could he confess that he wasn't just a regular man, but the heir of the powerful Moon family? Before he could speak, she looked at him and smiled, a smile that reached into his bones. "You're different. You're a good man, Francis. Honest. Nobody has ever defended me the way you did today. People like you. They're rare. I wish there were more of you in this world." Her words struck him harder than any insult ever could. As the night wore on, she handed him her bank card to pay for their food. But before Francis could even rise, Evelyn's head drooped forward. She had downed a bottle of alcohol earlier, and the weight of the day had finally pulled her under. She was fast asleep. Francis stared at her in disbelief. A woman like this, gentle, selfless, unpretentious, was a treasure beyond price. How could anyone, least of all Aidan Lim, reject her? Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and called Charles. When his loyal aide arrived, Francis gently lifted Evelyn in his arms. She was light, fragile, yet in his embrace she felt like the most valuable thing in the world. As he carried her home, something settled in his chest. A decision. This wasn't just pity anymore. This wasn't just a passing moment of chivalry. He wanted to be in her life, for real. Later that night he called Charles again. "I won't be coming back tonight," he said quietly. Charles nearly had a heart attack. "Sir?" he stammered. But Francis only looked down at Evelyn, sleeping peacefully, and for the first time in years he smiled, not as an heir to a dynasty, but as a man who had found something he didn't know he was searching for. The next morning, Evelyn woke up with a pounding headache. Her head spun from the wine, but beneath the haze a quiet relief filled her. She hadn't expected Francis to stay. She thought he would have left in the middle of the night, like a fleeting dream. Instead, there he was, still there, unbothered, almost too calm for someone who had walked into her chaos. As she hurried to get ready for work, she promised him he could stay for as long as he wanted. She even slipped a few dollar bills into his hand before running out the door. "Get yourself anything you need," she told him with a tired smile. Francis almost laughed. Dollar bills? For me? He, the man who could buy entire cities without blinking. Yet, instead of mocking the moment, he only looked at her with a softness that surprised even him. The morning sun streamed in through the curtains, and she seemed to glow in it, like she was made for light. He found himself staring long after she was gone, as though she had stolen the brightness of the day and taken it with her. But duty called. Before the whirlwind of Evelyn, Francis already had his schedule set. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Women, I can excuse. But business? Never. We do not work only for ourselves, but for the generations yet to come. To handle what has been given to us with laxity is to fail them all." It was one of the few things his father had managed to drill into him that stuck, and Francis knew if there was one thing the old man would never forgive, it was neglecting the Moon legacy. He dialed Charles. Within minutes, his ever-efficient assistant arrived, sleek black car waiting outside. Francis slid in without another word. He had a meeting with the manager of an accounting firm the Moon conglomerate had just acquired. The timing wasn't ideal, but Francis never allowed the empire to stop moving. Meanwhile, at Evelyn's workplace, whispers spread like wildfire. Shayna had made sure of it. Did she really think Aiden Lim would marry her? One colleague whispered behind a coffee mug. What a joke, another chuckled, shaking her head. The sneers came in waves, hushed voices laced with cruelty. Evelyn could feel the weight of their eyes, the mocking smiles that followed her through the hallways. Shame curled around her chest, but she held her head high. Every time the humiliation threatened to crush her, she remembered Francis, his unexpected warmth, the way he made her laugh despite her tears. She smiled faintly to herself. Maybe this misfortune was not the end. Maybe it was God's way of sending me someone better, someone meant for me. Her heart whispered a fragile hope. My knight in shining armor. Even if he has nothing, I'll stand by him. I'll support him. Maybe we won't even need a divorce. Maybe this is love. That same day, the atmosphere in the office shifted. The head of the firm, Mr. Kim, called for an emergency briefing. His voice was sharp, commanding. The heir of the Moon Empire will be visiting today, he announced. Francis Moon himself. His decisions about this firm are final, so I expect nothing less than perfection. Dress well, behave better, we must impress him. The room buzzed. Everyone knew what the Moon Empire meant. Power, wealth, influence. To meet the heir was to stand before a living legend. For Evelyn, it was just another reminder of her place. She was the most junior staff, the lowest rung on the ladder. Shayna made sure she never forgot it. Evelyn, Shayna sneered, eyes glittering with superiority. You'll serve coffee. Clean up after them. Stay out of the way. We don't want irrelevant people in the room when real business is being discussed. Who knows? If we do well, maybe we might even get a raise. Evelyn bit her tongue. Anger pricked her, but she swallowed it. Now wasn't the time to fight. She lowered her head and did as she was told. If only she knew who was about to walk through those doors. In the office kitchen, Evelyn carefully prepared the tray of drinks and snacks, her hands steady though her heart was restless. To calm her nerves, she pulled out her phone and dialed Francis. Are you doing okay? She asked softly, worried. Do you need anything? Was the money I left enough for you to move around? Maybe look for another job? On the other side of the city, Francis leaned back in the plush leather seat of his luxury car, the Moon Empire convoy rolling through the streets like a parade of wealth. When her name flashed across his screen, his chest warmed. He couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long while, someone was calling him. Not for business, not for power, but out of simple, genuine care. Yes, he lied gently. Everything's fine, the money's enough. Don't worry about me. He ended the call and stared at the phone, guilt flickering in his eyes. Charles, seated beside him, had been listening quietly. Finally, he turned to his boss. Why keep lying to her? Charles asked. You're a billionaire, sir. You could give her the world with a snap of your fingers. Francis's gaze lingered on the passing streets. Because what I've found with her, it's different. It's rare. If she knew who I really was, it would change everything. I don't want money to be the reason she stays. I want her. In time, I'll tell her. But not yet. Charles said nothing more, though the weight of Francis's words hung heavy in the car. Minutes later, the heir of the Moon Empire arrived. A fleet of black cars pulled into the firm's lot, their polished surfaces gleaming like obsidian. Employees rushed to the entrance, bowing low as the doors opened. Francis Moon stepped out in a sharp, tailored suit, his presence filling the space with silent authority. Every head lowered as he walked past, his entourage trailing like shadows. The ground itself seemed to tremble with his arrival. Inside, the head of the firm, Mr. Kim, launched into his presentation with nervous enthusiasm. Every word was chosen carefully, every gesture rehearsed. Across the room, Francis and his team listened in silence, the weight of judgment hanging over the air like a storm about to break. Meanwhile, Evelyn was still in the kitchen, carefully arranging items on the tray. Shayna stormed in, her voice sharp and impatient. "What are you still doing here? Hurry up and serve them," she snapped. Evelyn straightened, her patience fraying. "This isn't my job, Shayna. I'm only doing it because if the guests aren't served, I'll be the one blamed." She lifted the tray with both hands and pushed through the door into the boardroom. The atmosphere inside was stiff, charged with formality. Mr. Kim stood before a massive screen, his voice rising and falling with rehearsed confidence. Francis sat at the center of the long table, Charles by his side, his team spread around him. The moment Evelyn entered, Francis saw her. His heart stopped. His secret was no longer safe. She approached quietly, head lowered, carefully placing the tray on the table. But as she straightened, her eyes lifted, only to freeze on the man at the head of the room. Her breath caught. Francis. Not in a security uniform, not standing humbly at her side, but dressed in an immaculate suit, surrounded by power, and commanding the room with nothing but his presence. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Her voice broke the silence. "Francis." The entire room went still. Mr. Kim's face flushed with fury. He turned on her sharply. "Are you out of your mind? How dare you speak to him that way? Get out now. I'll deal with you after the meeting." But Evelyn couldn't move. Her feet felt nailed to the floor. Her wide eyes stayed locked on Francis, searching, desperate for an answer. Francis remained frozen, torn between confession and control. Mr. Kim's voice rose again, sharper this time. "Did you hear me? Get out!" Francis snapped back to the moment his decision made. He stood, his voice cold and cutting through the room like steel. "That's enough," he said. "She's with me. Don't ever talk to her like that again." Gasps rippled across the room. Mr. Kim's jaw dropped, his face draining of color. The employees stared in stunned silence, their carefully crafted masks of respect cracking into open shock. Evelyn's world spun. "It's real," she thought. "My boss is taking orders from my husband, my security husband." Her knees buckled. The tray rattled, then slipped from her hands as darkness clouded her vision. She fainted. Francis rushed to her side, catching her before she hit the ground. Charles hurried over, helping ease her into a chair as panic swept the room. In that moment, Francis didn't care about the empire, the presentation, or the shocked faces watching. All he cared about was the woman in his arms, the woman who had believed he was nothing, yet treated him as though he were everything. The room shifted in tone the moment Francis set his gaze on Mr. Kim. A silence hung in the boardroom, thick and suffocating, as though the very air knew a storm was about to break. Francis's voice, calm but cutting like glass, broke through the quiet. "To my knowledge," he said, his words deliberate, "Miss Evelyn is an accountant in this firm, so why is she the one serving us treats?" The weight of his question sent ripples across the room. Mr. Kim's throat tightened. He recognized danger in that tone, an authority that could crush reputations with a single command. He knew instantly this was no ordinary guest, and Evelyn was no ordinary employee in his office. Panic crept across his face as he stammered something about her being under supervision, then quickly summoned the one responsible, Shayna. The door opened and Shayna walked in with her usual air of arrogance, but the moment her eyes landed on Francis, her confidence shattered. Her chest tightened as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She remembered this face. The security guard she had mocked, belittled and dismissed in front of the entire board, when the heir of Moon Holdings was expected. Her stomach twisted, her world tilted. "You again," Francis said coldly, his expression unreadable, his presence towering. His words struck her like a verdict, final and merciless. Turning to Mr. Kim, his command came swift and sharp. "Terminate her employment, now, and see that she leaves this building immediately." The order was unquestionable, the kind of command that brooked no hesitation. Shayna's face drained of color. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but nothing came. In seconds, her world collapsed around her, the smugness, the authority, the pride she had once worn like armor, all gone. Mr. Kim, desperate to save his own skin, didn't waste a heartbeat. Papers were drawn. Security called. Shayna was escorted out of the building before she could even catch her breath. Only later would the cruel truth sink into her. The man she had mocked as nothing more than a lowly guard was the heir to the Moon Empire, the very dynasty she had dreamed of serving under. And she had thrown it all away in one careless moment of arrogance. When Evelyn stirred awake, still weak, her eyes fluttered open to find Francis by her side. Confusion clouded her voice as she whispered, "What's happening? Why are you here? At my office?" Francis looked at her, his face softening just slightly, though his eyes still carried the storm of everything that had unfolded. "I'm sorry you had to discover it this way," he said quietly. "I promise. I'll explain everything, as soon as we leave here." She was still weak, her steps unsteady, and Francis gently supported her as they made their way out of the office. His hand lingered on her arm, firm yet protective, guiding her through the curious eyes of the staff. Inside, he breathed a sigh of relief. Evelyn hadn't demanded answers right there in front of everyone. That was good. He would take her somewhere calm, somewhere private, and explain everything. Things hadn't spiraled into chaos, at least not yet. For a fleeting moment, a small smile touched his lips, but then a voice cut through the air like a blade. "So, this is the girl you abandoned me for?" Francis froze. Evelyn turned slowly, her chest tightening, her heart dropping. Standing in the middle of the general office was Miss Kayla of the Huang family, regal, cold, and furious. The very woman Francis was meant to marry on the day he disappeared, the day he disguised himself as a mere security guard and chose Evelyn instead. Kayla's eyes burned with contempt as she scanned Evelyn from head to toe. Her lips curled into a sneer. "You mean to tell me you've been avoiding your own home just to be with this lowlife, this peasant?" The words cut deep. Evelyn's body stiffened, shame and anger warring inside her. She wished the ground would open up and swallow her whole. Not again, she thought, her chest trembling. She had promised herself never to get entangled with Korea's wealthy families again. Not after the humiliation she had suffered at Aiden Lim's wedding. Yet, here she was, being dragged into their cruelty once more. Francis's jaw clenched. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then his voice broke it, strong and steady, carrying authority that left no room for doubt. "Listen carefully," he said, stepping in front of Evelyn like a shield. "This woman is my wife, and I intend to remain her husband. You will do well to watch how you speak about her." His eyes hardened, defiance burning in them. "Whatever arrangement you had was between you and my father. Who I marry, who I love, that is my choice, and mine alone." Gasps rippled through the office. The employees stared wide-eyed, shocked by the boldness of the Moon Empire heir. The same Francis they thought was untouchable was not only standing by Evelyn, but openly defending her, claiming her as his wife. Whispers flew across the room. Some hid their jealousy behind forced smiles. Others looked at Evelyn with newfound envy. She was no longer just the ordinary worker they once mocked. She was the woman their boss had chosen, in front of everyone. Kayla's face twisted in rage. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. "This girl was dumped by the ordinary Lim family. She's nothing but leftovers, scraps, and this is who you've chosen. Do you think your father will stand for this humiliation?" Her heels struck the floor hard as she turned sharply, storming out of the office. Her eyes glimmered with venomous intent, heading straight to report everything to Mr. Moon himself. Back at Evelyn's small but warm home, the air was heavy with silence. Francis sat across from her, his heart pounding, his words struggling to catch up with the storm inside him. "I never meant to hurt you," he began, his voice low, steady, almost pleading. "When I first met you, all I wanted was to save you from the insults of the Lim family. But as I got to know you, I realized you were different, special. I wanted to be part of your life. But then you said you hated wealthy people, and I didn't know how to tell you the truth. I was terrified of losing you." Evelyn looked away, her voice breaking. All I've ever wanted is a normal life, Francis. A life where I don't get compared, where I'm not called a low life at every turn. And besides, she took a breath, her chest trembling. Our marriage isn't even real. It started as a deal. We had already planned to divorce. I have no right to be angry. The words stabbed at Francis like knives. The thought of leaving her, of letting her go, stopped his very heartbeat. He reached out, pulling her gently but firmly into his arms. "I can't do that," he whispered. "I can't let you go. After meeting you, Evelyn, I could never move on to someone else. You're the one. And I swear, I will protect you, stand by you, no matter what happens. Tell me." His eyes searched hers desperately. "Tell me you feel it too." Her lips trembled. She couldn't deny it. From the first moment, something about Francis had drawn her in like a flame in the dark. He leaned closer, his hands framing her face with reverence. His voice softened to a sacred vow. "I love you, Evelyn. I want you in my life." Their breaths mingled. Slowly, carefully, his lips moved toward hers. She hesitated only for a moment, then closed the distance. Their hearts beat as one. When suddenly, the door burst open. "Mr. Moon." Francis froze, his blood running cold. Fear gripped him, not of losing his empire, but of the man standing in the doorway, his father, known across Korea for his iron will and ruthless resolve. If Mr. Moon wanted something, he always found a way to make it happen. But Francis didn't waver. Not this time, not for Evelyn. He stood tall, bracing himself like a soldier before battle. "So," Mr. Moon's deep voice rumbled, his sharp eyes scanning the room, "this is the girl." "Yes," Francis replied without hesitation, his voice strong. "This is Evelyn." Evelyn bowed politely, her voice a whisper. "Good evening, sir." But Mr. Moon ignored her greeting, his gaze fixed on his son. "And you truly wish to stay married to her?" Francis's answer was immediate. "Yes, she's the one I want in my life." For a long, tense moment, silence filled the room. Then, Mr. Moon's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Did I ever tell you," he began, his tone softer than either of them expected, "that your mother wasn't accepted by your grandparents when I first brought her home? They called her unworthy, but I stood firm in my decision to marry her, because I was certain. Today I can say it was one of the best choices I ever made." Francis blinked, stunned. Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't the anger they had braced themselves for. This wasn't rejection or scorn. This was understanding. Mr. Moon's gaze shifted to his son, sharp once more. "I raised you well, Francis. You're old enough to know what you want. If she's your choice, I won't stand in your way. Arrange a date for me to sit with her properly. And you, come back to the office soon." And with that, the Titan of the Moon Empire turned and left, his escort following him out into the night. The silence that followed was unreal. Evelyn and Francis stood frozen, staring at each other in shock. Had Mr. Moon just approved of them? It felt like a dream. Their hearts raced, their breaths uneven. Their connection, their marriage, it wasn't chance, it was fate. Francis stepped closer, wrapping her in his arms. His voice, low and tender, was filled with unshakable conviction. "I told you everything would work out. Nothing can stop my love for you, not in this life and not in the next." And this time, when their lips met, there was no interruption. Only a kiss, tender, passionate, eternal.
And that's the end of today's story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe about the storyline, the characters, a favorite scene, or even the ending. Drop your comments below. I always look forward to reading them. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. It really means a lot. I remain Silver, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay well. May God bless you abundantly, and always remember, Silver loves you.